This is an in-depth look at the updated BlackRock Geopolitical Risk Indicator, or BGRI. We'll be breaking down the top 10 risks that could define the next year, from simmering trade disputes to the ever-present shadow of conflict. It's a complex landscape, filled with interconnected threats and opportunities that demand our full attention. For those of you in the world of finance, portfolio management, and strategic investment, this isn't just news, it's critical intelligence. The decisions made in capitals from Washington to Beijing, the tensions in the Middle East, the subtle shifts in European politics, all of it creates ripples that can become waves in the global market. Our goal here is to go beyond the headlines, to unpack the nuances of each risk identified by BlackRock, providing the context and clarity needed to navigate what is shaping up to be a volatile and unpredictable year ahead. We'll methodically work our way through this list, dedicating a chapter to each of the 10 major risks. We'll examine the potential triggers, the likely impacts, and the broader implications for international stability and economic health. This is about arming you with a clearer perspective, helping you connect the dots between geopolitical events and financial outcomes. The world doesn't operate in a vacuum, and neither should our understanding of it. Let's get started. The first major risk we need to confront is the specter of global trade protectionism. For decades, the prevailing winds blew in the direction of globalization and free trade. Now, those winds are changing course, and the forecast is one of increasing turbulence. At the heart of this risk is the potential for a dramatic escalation in United States tariffs, not just on a few select goods, but across the board. This isn't a minor policy tweak, it's a fundamental shift that threatens to upend the very architecture of global commerce that has been in place for generations. The ripple effects of such a move would be felt in every corner of the global economy, from multinational corporations to small businesses relying on international supply chains. The primary target in this escalating trade conflict remains China. However, the friction is no longer confined to that single, albeit massive, relationship. We're seeing the potential for these protectionist measures to extend to long-standing allies, including the European Union. The challenge of striking new trade deals in this environment is immense. Negotiations that were once about lowering barriers are now fraught with political tension and national security concerns. Reaching a comprehensive agreement with either Beijing or Brussels seems increasingly distant, as trust erodes and strategic competition takes precedence over economic cooperation. This isn't just about economics, it's about a fundamental realignment of global partnerships. The impact on global trade volumes could be severe. We're talking about a potential contraction that would slow economic growth worldwide. Businesses that have built their models on the assumption of stable open markets would be forced into a costly and disruptive process of reshoring or nearshoring their operations. This creates uncertainty, a word that investors and markets universally dislike. The intricate web of supply chains that delivers everything from microchips to medical supplies would face unprecedented strain, leading to potential shortages, higher prices for consumers, and a significant drag on corporate profitability across multiple sectors. Ultimately, this trend toward protectionism signals a retreat from the interconnected world we've come to know. It's a world where national interests are increasingly defined in opposition to, rather than in concert with, global cooperation. For finance professionals, this means reevaluating the geographic exposure of portfolios, stress testing supply chain vulnerabilities, and preparing for a new era where political risk is as important as market risk. The easy assumptions of the past are gone, replaced by a complex and unpredictable landscape where the rules of the game are being rewritten before our very eyes. We turn now to a region perennially on edge, the Middle East, where the risk of a regional war has escalated to a level not seen in years. The current conflict, initially centered on Israel and Hamas, has refused to remain contained. It has metastasized, drawing in a complex web of state and non-state actors, each with their own agenda. We're witnessing a dangerous domino effect: attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanon, disruptive and brazen assaults on commercial shipping in the Red Sea by the Houthis in Yemen, and retaliatory strikes that cross multiple borders. The potential for a single miscalculation to ignite a much broader, more devastating conflict is dangerously high. At stake is not just regional stability, but also the world's energy supply. The Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point through which a significant portion of global oil transits, remains exceptionally vulnerable. Any direct confrontation involving Iran could threaten this vital artery, sending shockwaves through energy markets and the global economy. The repeated attacks on energy infrastructure, both on land and at sea, are a constant reminder of this fragility. Ceasefire negotiations, which offer fleeting glimpses of hope, have repeatedly broken down, undermined by deep-seated mistrust and the irreconcilable goals of the primary combatants. The diplomatic pathways to de-escalation are narrow and treacherous. The roles of key nations are also shifting in this volatile environment. Iran continues to leverage its network of proxies across the region, from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, projecting power and challenging its adversaries without necessarily engaging in direct state-to-state warfare. At the same time, Syria remains a fractured battleground, a theater where regional and global powers, including Russia and the United States, pursue their competing interests. The delicate balances of power that once provided a semblance of predictability are being upended, creating a power vacuum that more radical elements are eager to fill. This is a multi-front crisis with no easy off-ramps. For financial markets, the risk translates into sustained energy price volatility, disruptions to global shipping that affect supply chains far beyond the region, and a general flight to safety in assets like gold and the United States dollar. The human cost, of course, is immeasurable and continues to mount daily. The challenge for strategists is to price in a risk that is both highly probable and profoundly unpredictable in its ultimate scale and scope. The entire region is a tinderbox, and the sparks are flying closer and closer to the fuse. The third risk on our list is perhaps the most consequential for the long-term global order: the intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China. This is more than a trade dispute or a diplomatic disagreement. It is a fundamental rivalry between two superpowers with competing visions for the future. The rhetoric has grown sharper, the actions more assertive, and the potential for direct confrontation, once a remote possibility, is now a subject of serious discussion in the halls of power. This rivalry is the defining geopolitical narrative of our time, and its tendrils reach into every other risk we will discuss tonight. The most dangerous flashpoint remains Taiwan. Beijing considers the self-governing island a renegade province and has not renounced the use of force to achieve unification. The United States, while adhering to a policy of strategic ambiguity, has strengthened its defense commitments to Taipei and has become increasingly explicit about its resolve to deter an invasion. This creates a high-stakes military standoff in the Taiwan Strait, where naval patrols, air sorties, and military exercises by both sides increase the risk of an accident or miscalculation that could spiral into open conflict. The consequences of such a war would be catastrophic, not just for the region, but for the entire global economy. Beyond Taiwan, tensions are also simmering in the South China Sea. China's expansive territorial claims and its construction of militarized artificial islands have been challenged by the United States and its regional allies through freedom of navigation operations. This has turned a vital international waterway into a zone of persistent military friction. Adding another layer of danger is the ongoing nuclear competition. Both nations are modernizing and expanding their nuclear arsenals, raising fears of a new arms race that lacks the guardrails and communication channels that helped manage the risks of the First Cold War. This strategic competition is forcing other nations to choose sides, fraying long-standing alliances and creating a more fractured and polarized world. For investors, it means navigating a landscape where political allegiances can suddenly shift, where sanctions can be imposed with little warning, and where entire markets can be cut off. The United States-China rivalry is not a distant problem for diplomats. It is a clear and present risk that is reshaping supply chains, technology standards, and the fundamental assumptions that have underpinned global business strategy for the last 30 years. It demands a new level of diligence and a profound understanding of the geopolitical chessboard. Closely intertwined with the U.S. China rivalry is our fourth risk: the accelerating decoupling of the global technology ecosystem. We're actually witnessing the digital equivalent of the Berlin Wall being erected, creating two distinct and often incompatible spheres of technological influence, one centered around the United States and the other around China. This separation isn't happening by accident. It's really the result of deliberate policy choices driven by national security concerns. The U.S. has implemented some pretty stringent export controls on advanced semiconductors and other critical technologies, aiming to slow China's military modernization. In response, Beijing is pouring massive resources into achieving technological self-sufficiency. The impact of this schism on global supply chains is, honestly, profound and disruptive. For decades, companies operated on a model of a single, integrated global supply chain, designing products in one country, sourcing components from another, and assembling them in a third. That model is now broken. Companies are being forced to navigate a complex and costly bifurcation, creating separate supply chains for the U.S. and Chinese markets, a one-world, two-systems approach that duplicates effort, erodes efficiency, and increases costs for consumers. This is particularly acute in industries like telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. This technological decoupling extends beyond hardware and supply chains. It's also about data, standards, and the very architecture of the internet. We're moving towards a splinter net, where data flows are restricted by national borders and different countries operate under different rules and technical standards. This fragmentation threatens to stifle the cross-border collaboration that has been a powerful engine of innovation for decades. The free exchange of ideas and research that led to so many breakthroughs is now being hampered by geopolitical walls, potentially slowing the pace of scientific and technological progress for everyone. For finance professionals, this risk creates a whole new set of challenges. It requires a deep understanding of a company's technological dependencies and its exposure to either the U.S. or Chinese tech ecosystem. Investments in the tech sector are no longer just about the quality of a product, they're about its geopolitical viability. The risk of a company being blacklisted, losing access to critical components, or being shut out of a major market has become a central part of the due diligence process. The digital Iron Curtain is descending, and navigating its contours will be a defining challenge for global business in the years to come. In our increasingly digitized world, the fifth major risk is one that respects no borders and can strike with blinding speed: a major cyber attack. The threat landscape has evolved dramatically. We're no longer just talking about lone hackers or simple ransomware. We're actually facing sophisticated state-sponsored cyber operations capable of targeting the most critical infrastructure that underpins modern society. Power grids, financial systems, transportation networks, water supplies, and healthcare systems are all in the crosshairs. A successful large-scale attack on any one of these could cause chaos and disruption on a scale equivalent to a major physical disaster. The rise of artificial intelligence is adding a dangerous new dimension to this threat. AI is being used by malicious actors to develop more sophisticated and evasive malware, to craft more convincing phishing campaigns, and to identify vulnerabilities in complex systems at a speed and scale that human defenders really struggle to match. It's an arms race in cyberspace where offensive capabilities are developing at a frightening pace. The same AI tools that promise to revolutionize industries can be weaponized to undermine them, creating a new generation of threats that are harder to detect and defend against. The risk of a major cyber attack is significantly elevated during periods of heightened geopolitical conflict. Cyber warfare has become a standard component of modern statecraft, used by nations to disrupt adversaries, conduct espionage, and signal intent without resorting to conventional military force. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, for example, has been accompanied by a relentless barrage of cyber attacks from both sides. Similarly, election cycles in major democracies have become prime targets for foreign influence operations, which often employ cyber tools to spread disinformation and erode trust in the democratic process. For the financial sector, the threat is existential. The global financial system is a vast, interconnected network of digital transactions. A successful attack that compromises the integrity of a major bank, a stock exchange, or a payment system could trigger a crisis of confidence and systemic financial instability. This is why regulators and institutions are investing billions in cybersecurity, but the attackers only need to be successful once. For investors, this means scrutinizing the cyber resilience of the companies in their portfolios, as a major breach is no longer just an IT problem. It's a fundamental business and reputational risk that can wipe out shareholder value overnight. While the focus of national security has shifted towards great power competition, our sixth risk is a stark reminder that the threat of terrorism has not vanished. In fact, it persists and evolves. The risk of a major terror attack, particularly against U.S. interests at home or abroad, remains a significant concern for intelligence agencies. The collapse of the government in Afghanistan has created a potential safe haven for groups like ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda to regroup, train, and plot external operations. The dispersal of fighters from former conflict zones in Syria and Iraq also means that experienced operatives could be living in countries around the world, just waiting for an opportunity to strike. Terrorist groups, much like nation-states, are adept at exploiting new technologies to their advantage. They use encrypted communication platforms to coordinate, social media to radicalize and recruit, and online payment systems to finance their operations. There's growing concern that they could also leverage emerging technologies like drones for attacks on soft targets, or even attempt to acquire chemical or biological agents. The barrier to entry for causing mass disruption is in some ways lower than it has ever been, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation from security services to stay ahead of the evolving tactics. Geopolitical instability often acts as an accelerant for terrorism. The conflict in the Middle East, for instance, is used as a powerful recruiting narrative by extremist groups seeking to capitalize on regional anger and grievances. They frame the conflict as a broader war against Islam, a message that can resonate with disaffected individuals globally, and inspire lone actor or small cell attacks that are notoriously difficult to detect and prevent. This creates a volatile feedback loop, where regional conflicts fuel global extremist ideologies, which in turn can lead to attacks far from the original epicenter of the conflict. Recent policy actions, such as the designation of specific organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, reflect the ongoing effort to counter these threats. However, the nature of the threat is diffuse and decentralized. It's not just about established groups with clear command structures. It's also about a global ideology that can inspire violence anywhere, anytime. For the business community, this means a continued focus on physical security for personnel and facilities, especially for those operating in high-risk regions. It's a reminder that even as we focus on state-level risks, the danger posed by determined non-state actors remains a potent and unpredictable variable. Our seventh risk brings us to the doorstep of Europe, where, the largest land war on the continent since World War II continues to rage. The ongoing war in Ukraine is the focal point of a direct and dangerous confrontation between Russia and the collective power of the NATO alliance. While NATO is not a direct combatant, its massive military, financial, and intelligence support for Ukraine has, effectively made it a party to the conflict. Russia, in turn, views this support as an existential threat, creating a precarious situation where the line between proxy war and direct conflict is, honestly, dangerously thin. The risk of escalation beyond Ukraine's borders, whether by accident or design, remains the single greatest threat to European security. The battlefield in Ukraine has settled into a grinding war of attrition. Both sides have suffered immense casualties and expended vast amounts of military hardware, yet a clear path to a decisive military victory for either side appears elusive. This stalemate is itself a source of risk. A prolonged conflict drains resources, frays political unity within the Western alliance, and increases the temptation for one side or the other to escalate in a desperate bid to break the deadlock. Russia's periodic nuclear saber rattling is a constant chilling reminder of the ultimate stakes involved in this confrontation. Reaching a durable peace agreement presents a monumental challenge. The core interests of the primary actors are fundamentally opposed. Ukraine insists on the restoration of its full territorial integrity, including all lands occupied by Russia since 2014. Russia, on the other hand, is unlikely to relinquish the territories it has formally annexed, seeing them as vital to its security and national identity. The United States and its European allies are committed to preventing a Russian victory, but may have differing views on what an acceptable end state looks like. This misalignment of goals makes a negotiated settlement incredibly difficult to achieve. This conflict has already reshaped the European security architecture, prompting historically neutral countries like Finland and Sweden to join NATO and triggering a surge in defense spending across the continent. For financial markets, the war continues to fuel uncertainty around energy and food security, contributes to inflationary pressures, and forces a fundamental reassessment of risk in Eastern Europe. The longer the war continues, the greater the chance of a black swan event, a missile straying into NATO territory, a direct clash in the Black Sea, that could transform this devastating regional war into a global crisis. As the great powers compete and the global order fractures, the eighth risk on our list concerns the immense pressure this places on the political systems of emerging markets. For years, many of these nations benefited from globalization, building their economies on export-led growth and, relatively stable geopolitical conditions. Now, that foundation is cracking. The trend toward protectionism, the bifurcation of technology, and the volatility in commodity markets are creating some pretty severe economic headwinds. When economies come under stress, political stability often follows, leading to an increased risk of social unrest, government collapse, and unpredictable policy shifts. The economies that are most vulnerable are those heavily dependent on exports, particularly to a single trading bloc like China or the West. As their major customers turn inward or demand becomes more volatile, these nations face declining revenues, rising unemployment, and growing public discontent. This economic pain can easily translate into political anger, fueling populist movements, ethnic tensions, and challenges to incumbent governments. We could see a wave of political crises across parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, as leaders struggle to manage the fallout from a less forgiving global economic environment. The picture is not universally bleak, however. The report suggests that Latin America as a region may be relatively better positioned to weather this storm. Many Latin American economies are less integrated into the complex Asian supply chains that are now being disrupted. Furthermore, the trend of near-shoring, companies moving their manufacturing closer to North American markets, could present a significant economic opportunity for countries like Mexico and others in the region. This could create a divergence in the fortunes of emerging markets, with some benefiting from the new global alignment while others are left behind. For investors, this requires a much more granular and discerning approach to emerging markets. The old strategy of treating them as a monolithic asset class is no longer viable. It is now essential to analyze each country's political stability, its specific trade dependencies, its fiscal health, and its resilience to external shocks. The risk of expropriation, currency controls, and sudden regulatory changes is rising in many jurisdictions. Navigating the emerging market landscape in this new era means paying as much attention to the political climate in a nation's capital as to the economic data. We now turn our attention to one of the world's most enduring and unpredictable geopolitical flashpoints, the Korean Peninsula. The risk of a conflict involving North Korea, our ninth major risk, has entered a new and more dangerous phase. Under Kim Jong-un, Pyongyang has engaged in a relentless series of escalatory actions, conducting a record number of missile tests, including those of intercontinental ballistic missiles theoretically capable of reaching the United States. This is not just posturing, it is a clear demonstration of advancing military capabilities designed to intimidate its neighbors and deter any potential U.S. intervention. The regime's focus on its nuclear buildup is unwavering. North Korea has enshrined its status as a nuclear weapons state in its constitution, effectively closing the door on denuclearization talks for the foreseeable future. The goal is no longer a bargaining chip to be traded away for economic aid. It is now considered the ultimate guarantor of the regime's survival. This creates a permanent state of nuclear risk in Northeast Asia, where any conventional conflict on the peninsula could quickly escalate to a nuclear exchange with devastating consequences for South Korea, Japan, and the thousands of U.S. troops stationed in the region. The diplomatic dynamics surrounding North Korea have also shifted dramatically. The united front of pressure from the international community has crumbled. Russia, bogged down in its war in Ukraine, has grown closer to Pyongyang, reportedly receiving artillery shells and munitions in exchange for what experts fear could be advanced military technology. China, while still publicly committed to stability, is less willing to apply significant pressure on its volatile neighbor, viewing it as a strategic buffer against U.S. influence. This has left the United States, South Korea, and Japan to coordinate their own trilateral defense posture, creating a more polarized and confrontational environment. This new alignment emboldens Pyongyang, reducing its fear of international isolation and sanctions. It allows the regime to act with greater impunity, further raising the risk of a miscalculation. A limited skirmish along the heavily fortified border, a naval clash in disputed waters, or a botched missile test could all serve as a potential trigger for a wider conflict. For financial markets in Asia, particularly in Seoul and Tokyo, the North Korea risk is a constant underlying factor that can cause sharp, sudden sell-offs in response to any provocation from the north. The Hermit Kingdom remains a black box, and its next move is a perpetual and dangerous unknown. Our final risk brings us back to Europe, but this time we are looking inward, at the risk of political and economic fragmentation across the continent. While the war in Ukraine has forged a sense of unity in the face of an external threat, Europe is grappling with a host of internal pressures that are straining its cohesion. Subdued economic growth, a legacy of the energy crisis and persistent inflation, is creating economic hardship and fueling political discontent. The cost of living crisis is a potent issue in nearly every member state, eroding support for incumbent governments and mainstream parties. Energy security remains a paramount concern. While Europe successfully weaned itself off Russian gas at a tremendous cost, the transition to a new energy mix is fraught with challenges. The reliance on more expensive liquefied natural gas imports makes the continent vulnerable to global price shocks, and the ambitious green transition requires massive investment and political will that can be difficult to sustain during an economic downturn. Disagreements over energy policy, burden sharing, and the pace of decarbonization are a significant source of friction within the European Union. This economic and energy anxiety is feeding political fragmentation. We are seeing a rise in support for populist and nationalist parties on both the far right and far left across the continent. These parties often campaign on anti-EU, anti-immigration, and protectionist platforms that challenge the core tenets of European integration. As these groups gain more power, either by entering government coalitions or by shaping the political debate from the opposition, they could make EU decision-making more difficult, gridlocking policy on everything from budgets to foreign affairs, and undermining the bloc's ability to act cohesively on the world stage. The prospect of changing U.S.-Europe relations adds another layer of uncertainty. A potential shift in U.S. foreign policy towards a more America-first stance could weaken the transatlantic alliance and force Europe to take on greater responsibility for its own security, a task for which it may be unprepared. For investors, a fragmented Europe means greater policy uncertainty, regulatory divergence between member states, and potential risks to the stability of the Eurozone itself. The European project has always been a political construct, and the forces pulling it apart are now growing stronger, posing a quiet but profound risk to the global order. And there you have it. From the rising walls of protectionism to the internal strains on European unity, these are the top 10 global geopolitical risks, as identified by BlackRock's latest indicator. Each one represents a significant challenge to global stability and economic prosperity. What's crucial to understand is that these risks are not isolated, they are deeply interconnected. A conflict in the Middle East impacts energy prices in Europe. A tech decoupling between the U.S. and China disrupts supply chains for emerging markets. It's a complex, interwoven tapestry of cause and effect. For those of you who manage assets, advise clients, or make strategic business decisions, this landscape demands more than just passing attention. Staying informed is the first and most critical step. The world is changing rapidly, and the assumptions that held true just a few years ago may no longer apply. We encourage you to consider these risks not as distant headlines but as tangible factors that must be integrated into your strategies, your risk models, and your conversations with clients. Acknowledging uncertainty is the first step toward navigating it effectively. The goal tonight was not to be alarmist but to be clear-eyed and realistic about the challenges that lie ahead. By understanding the pressure points in the global system, we can better prepare for the volatility they may create. Prudence, diligence, and a commitment to deep analysis will be your most valuable assets in the coming year. Thank you for joining me. Stay safe and stay informed.